Lovely. Okay, so we are going to get started. Welcome everyone to today's MISC seminar series. For those who are unfamiliar, MISC stands for Michigan Interactive and Social Computing Group. And we have bi-weekly, sometimes weekly speakers that come from all over the world to share their work with us. So today we have Dr. Jennifer Pierre, who is a UX researcher at YouTube, conducting research at the intersection of fan funding, gaming, and content creation. She received her doctorate and MLIS degrees from the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. Her research expertise is in social media, games, critical data studies, and social informatics. Dr. Pierre's work explores how people, especially underrepresented and minoritized groups, use media and data to form and maintain communities. Today, will be presenting on designing for belonging and inclusion through games research. And she also teaches here in the School of Information, UX and Gaming course. So join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Pierre.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that introduction. Oh, let me see if I need to move this up further. Does that sound okay? Is it picking up enough? Okay, great. All right. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to share some of this work with you all. Just as a quick bit of context, I'm going to be sharing some work and a project that I was part of and led at Stadia Games and Entertainment. I will be referring to some things in the past tense because unfortunately this is now a former gaming division of Google. We'll talk about that a little more in a few slides. But the work that I'm going to share here is still work that is ongoing. It kind of continues and lives on in other forms. Specifically, this is on developing a framework and evaluation process for how to identify needs and address specific needs and issues for evaluating diversity, equity, and inclusion in game development. All right, so quick look at the agenda for today. We're going to review some background. There is a lot of background that drove the development of this work and this project in particular. And I'll review a few of the kind of core questions that drove this project. Then we'll look at the methodological approach. There were a lot of moving pieces here, in part because this is part research, part applied design work. So it did involve a lot of kind of cross-functional stakeholder development. So there was input and collaboration with not only our research team, but also product managers, producers, designers, engineers, everyone who was involved and invested in the way that we wanted to standardize and concretize the way that we were developing our games, and especially with centering inclusion as a part of that. Then I'll review the findings and we'll end with discussion and conclusion, really taking a step back to look at this within a broader context and better understand why all of this is important to focus on and where we can go next. All right, I know that Robin did a fantastic introduction. Thank you so much for that. I'll just quickly touch on the fact that I do believe I'm qualified to speak about this in part because of my background, not only in games working at Stadia Games and Entertainment, but also as a social media researcher. So I bring to this project and this type of work a background that views video games as part of a broader kind of media landscape context. So really thinking about video games as one form of media, just like any other form of traditional and or digital media.
Your slides are a little slid over.
Oh, whoops, sorry. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, sorry about that. Okay, so before we jump in, I'd like to start with, I know many of you are eating right now, so it's okay if you don't have the energy. We can also just reflect on it silently, you don't have to share. But I do think it's kind of fun to have a little bit of an interactive moment during talks because it can be a lot of just me talking. So to get us into the mindset of this work, I would like to start with an open question. What does an inclusive gaming experience feel like to you? So a quick way to kind of break this down too is if you play games yourself, or if you have before, maybe think back to a time or a moment where something in a game felt particularly inclusive. And for those of you who don't play games, you can also think about another form of media where this has taken place for you. So a TV show, a movie, maybe a book that you've read that felt particularly inclusive. I think I see something in the, thank you, Taiwan. They shared people from different age groups being able to play together. I think that's a really great example. So games maybe that do a particularly good job with not trying to kind of focus on or target a particular age range. Anyone else have an example that they would like to share? Sure, yeah.
Or like not being afraid to turn on the voice to communicate with others, especially for a woman. There's a lot of men like that, go crazy.
That's a really excellent one. So being extra careful about, well, I think the example there would be feeling actually safe in turning that on and knowing that there are kind of protections in place or design features in place that will maybe pair you with kind of the folks that you actually want to play with and that are going to be the right partners for you. Yeah.
Like different video levels. So being able to or your story modes, I think is often what it's called in this game, story modes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great one. Yeah.
And then that point, like when games, I've seen some games that turn me off to them because when you do have different story modes, some games in the past would make fun of you in the game if you chose an easier mode. So games that make it feel okay, regardless of your level of experience or your ability to play the game, like you at any experience level can come in and just immediately start playing.
Yes, that's a really fantastic one. We talk a lot about challenge and difficulty level. There's a lot of, I think, sometimes problematic precedent that's wrapped up in that. So really good one. Any other? Yeah.
Sometimes I spend an exorbitant amount of time in my character customization. Because like sometimes to immerse myself in it does make sense to have having like alter ego is kind of fun. But
I guess.
I think it's like seeing representation of how you want to be seen can be pretty powerful.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a fantastic one. One of the readings I assign in my class is a book by Sherry Turkle that has a whole chapter focused on, it's called Life Beyond the Screen, but it has a whole chapter focused on character development and what it means to have the possibility to not only see yourself, but also see maybe an alter ego or kind of feel comfortable playing around with different identities. So really great one. And Ella put in happy, and I feel like I find my place. I'm part of it. Yeah, establishing a sense of belonging. Definitely an excellent one. We're going to be talking a lot about belonging today too. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing, especially during lunchtime. Appreciate it. All right. So thank you for sharing all of that. I do think a lot of the examples and the stories that you shared are great examples of why I decided to embark on this work with my team. A lot of this was really around better understanding what actually contributes to those types of experiences and what contributes to those moments. And really importantly, how to standardize a process for helping players achieve that type of feeling in a consistent way. So ideally, every time they want to play a game. So a couple more background slides before I get into the full body of work here, just to set shared context. As I mentioned before, this was all work that I was doing as part of a team at Stadia Games and Entertainment. Just a quick kind of look at what this actual team was and what the kind of mission was. This is Stadia. This was Google's video game org, really focused on cloud-based, so console-less gaming, essentially, trying to expand our access, the technical infrastructure that we were able to use to play games. And this was the core mission. So it's essentially expanding the creation, access, and enjoyment of groundbreaking interactive entertainment. And when I started to think about this mission shortly after joining the team, I thought it was just really immediately obvious the different ways that integrating diversity, equity, inclusion really play a key role in carrying out this mission. So as you might see here, access is a really big part of this. Enjoyment is a really big part of this. And how to achieve that as key goals for all of our players really involves and necessitates a concrete set of guidelines. Sorry, I don't know if this is me moving the mic. I'll just hold it like this. A concrete set of guidelines for how we include, accommodate, and celebrate all different types of players, groups, and identities, especially those that are kind of underrepresented in video games. Okay, and last bit of background here. I know that I imagined most, if not all of you, are familiar with the concept of diversity, equity, inclusion, but there are a lot of different ways that we can define that. So I'm going to start with the broadest definition that we worked with. A little bit later in our method section, we're going to get into what that actually meant in an applied sense. But just so that you know where I'm coming from when I talk about DEI, I'm thinking about diversity as the representation of varied identities and differences, both on the individual and collective level. So a quick example of what that could look like in the game space is games like Overwatch or Read-Only Memories, where you're seeing an increasingly kind of diverse set of characters and backstories, which is really exciting to see. Equity is fair treatment, equality of opportunity and fairness, and access to information and resources. Quick example of that in the game space might be, as some of you already touched on earlier, having access to lots of different types of customizable, maybe character creation in a way that regardless of who you are as a player, you're able to kind of see yourself represented if that's your goal as a player. You can see that in one of the character creation elements like in the Pokemon game. And lastly, inclusion is really being able to establish a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people. And I think this is one of the most important pieces in games, because historically there has been a lot of exclusion in games and game spaces. So not only in individual games and how you can kind of use the controls or interact with a specific game, but also how you can participate in gaming culture more broadly. It's often kind of fraught, the specific term of being a gamer, for example. So even using more inclusive terms like player can help with this. Quick example in this space is Animal Crossing, where I think it's a great representation of the embrace of all sorts of different types of games. So games that maybe are centered around social interaction, community building, and maybe a more kind of even relaxed, less aggressive way, not necessarily adhering to a really specific way of approaching our gameplay. All right, so we want to incorporate all of these different concepts and pieces into our game development process so that we can create a specific environment that's accessible in all of the ways that we want it to be. So this is kind of expanding our understanding of accessibility to include some of the more traditional forms like physical and cognitive accessibility to even being psychologically accessible. So regardless of kind of who you are as a player, regardless of your identity, background, or even your relationship to gaming, whether you're a beginner or a really seasoned gamer, being able to access games in the ways that make most sense to you. So a lot of this also centered on understanding why DEI was important, not only for our particular game teams and the particular studios that we're working with, but video games more broadly as an industry. And so our team put a lot of time into initial conversations as we were developing this research project to really break down what achieving physical, cognitive, and psychological accessibility actually means in an applied sense. And we identified these major reasons that drove the development of the project and helped us gain also kind of the right support and collaboration for moving forward with this. So the three themes here are: it's crucial for avoiding harm, first and foremost. It supports underrepresented users. And it's also imaginative and transformative in that it's not just about kind of avoiding harm in a reactive way, but it can help us situate the right kinds of needs, the right kinds of development processes that enable us to proactively think about and address all the different ways that our players might be wanting to engage with our games. So to explain the first 2 points a little bit more, really this is just acknowledging that we recognize modern depictions of things like ingrained stereotypes can still persist in video games in the same way that they do with any other form of media. And in turn, that can cause harm or alienation, especially for players who maybe haven't always felt as welcome to these spaces. So to create that welcoming space, to create that sense of belonging, we really need a set of actionable criteria. We need to develop and identify that to evaluate it. And on that last point, we realize and acknowledge through this work that we can push the industry forward by focusing on the voices of minoritized groups, underrepresented player groups. This enables us to center new voices and ideas by using these criteria, again, in service of proactive inclusion. So a couple of kind of examples of the things that we are trying to actively avoid. So though this can often be difficult to confront, a lot of the literature review work that we did, a lot of the early conversations that we did actually involved unearthing the types of problematic stereotypes that we see in media that continue to manifest in video games. Some of you might be familiar with these three stereotypes that you're seeing on the screen here, but lots of really fantastic media research has been done, especially traditional media research, that point out these kind of three key depictions or portrayals, especially of Black women in media, the Mammy, the Sapphire, and the Jezebel, that continue to kind of morph and adapt in different forms of media that we see over, several decades. And we call this out because often there is the assumption that video games are distinct. They're a more kind of maybe modern or contemporary form of media. So it's more difficult or maybe not even possible for these types of stereotypes to live on or to be continued in this type of media or in video games. And a lot of the work that we were doing as part of this project was to actually further education and understanding around the fact that that's actually not true. These stereotypes continue to surface even in contemporary games. A couple of examples on the screen here are from Metal Gear Solid. Over on the left, the middle one is Grand Theft Auto. The third one, all the way on the right, is Splatoon, which is actually a kid's game too. So a lot of unpacking of the types of things that we're seeing, regardless of kind of who the target audience for video games are. All of these were also pulled from research from two video game scholars, Ron and Han, in 2019, when they were doing a survey of different forms of video games and the types of representation that they were seeing there. Out of their sample, they found that 90% of Black female characters and 45% of the white female characters that they were analyzing were treated as either props or victims of violence in many popular video games. So of course, there has been progress made since then, but really important to recognize and kind of acknowledge where we are as a field, where we are as an industry, and where we have still to go. So really using a lot of this kind of background to acknowledge the importance and the gravity of this area. So all of this is to say too that a robust integration of DI into a game development process really supports access to content that's going to appeal to all different types of players. So when we as players who aren't seeing ourselves represented in the ways that we like or aren't able to play in ways that feel kind of inclusive to us, that actually isn't creating a space where the content is appealing to everyone that it can appeal to. It's really forming a specific problematic barrier to play. So as a form of media, games represent this delicate balance in supporting and creating an accommodating space for players and also celebrating these different forms of exploration and artistic expression that we can have as players and creators. So we use the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion and the programs and kind of robust evaluation processes that we're setting up to center a welcoming and accommodating space and environment for everyone. This also requires a lot of thoughtfulness about not only the way that we create games, but the ways that we acquire games and the ways that we kind of put together a game portfolio so that it can be balanced and inclusive, and ideally it kind of avoids a lot of the longstanding issues that we've seen in the past. So to address all of these issues, after having these initial conversations, after developing an initial, especially literature review and landscape review of what we were seeing happening across the industry, what we were seeing happening in our games, we decided to embark on developing a specific evaluative rubric as the applied design kind of outcome of this project to ensure that all of our content, whatever genre or style it might be, can actually enable players to have the positive, meaningful, and potentially transformative experiences that we know they can. So we had the central goal of inclusion, and rather than placing limits on any one specific type of content, we wanted to create guidelines to ensure that all of our content can be really achieving this core goal. And this was in service of the following research questions. First, at an overarching broader level, what does it actually mean to integrate equity and foster belonging in a video game? So what are kind of the core components of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we should be looking for, that we should be identifying? How do we standardize that across all of these different games and genres? Because the look and feel of a game can change so dramatically across the different types of genres or games that you're dealing with. And then after identifying that, what is the ideal state that we want to be able to have players achieve when they play a game? How can we uncover specific needs that we want to address and assess and evaluate and measure over time? And lastly, at a more meta level, how can we translate this into an ongoing evaluation process that enables game companies to really actionably address those needs that we identify. So there's sort of the breakdown piece where we're really using research to identify and uncover what the different needs are and components are. And then there's this ongoing kind of measurement and evaluation piece. So now I'll move into sharing a little bit more about our process. I just took you through kind of that whole background, a lot of what we talked about to uncover and identify the actual problem that we were facing. And here's our approach to address those questions. So I mentioned before that I was going to revisit DEI a little bit more. One of the first steps of our process, especially from a methodological approach, was narrowing down and furthering our scope and understanding of DEI to especially assess how this materializes and can be applied within the gaming and Stadia context. So while we could pull up examples of what DEI looked like in games, we really wanted to further define that for our specific game team and for the specific project and process. So here we pulled out two particular concepts and design approaches that we decided were going to be the core pillar or the kind of core foundation for how we were going to think about DEI in a game development context. So first we used product inclusion. So this rubric and evaluation process defined DEI specifically for our team through the lens of product inclusion, which is a really great line of work across the company that's focused on identifying and assessing and addressing the needs of diverse users throughout the product development process. There's a lot more reading that you all can do on that. Happy to share sources after. And then the second piece was in the actual design realm, using inclusive design methods. So to meet these product inclusion standards, to actually really robustly address that concept and that set of theories, the rubric uses different principles of inclusive design as a core method. So we use this, our rubric and process use product inclusion and inclusive design principles to ensure that Stadia games, all of our games that we were putting together and developing, are accessible to all of our players. And it was really trying to address the two goals of preventing identity-based barriers to play. So ensuring that regardless of your background or identity, you're able to play in ways that feel good to you, that help you feel included and like you belong. And then, as I mentioned earlier, identifying and encouraging areas for proactive inclusion. So really ensuring that a player's identity is in no way a limit or a target in their ability to enjoy a game on the platform, really complementing a lot of the current accessibility work that we had already been embarking on, where we can ensure equitable game enjoyment and play, and then using especially inclusive design principles to identify where we can go above and beyond and proactively integrate specific features into our game content that promote inclusion. Here are some of the key methods that we used to actually achieve those goals. So because we were working with a cross-functional team on this, it wasn't only it was research-led, but not necessarily only a research project. We were involving, as I mentioned before, designers, engineers, producers, all different folks within this work. We started with research-led heuristic evaluations, which is a very common and popular method that's used within the game space. So really using our expertise to carefully break down and integrate specific core elements that we were identifying in a game. And in our case, aligning and matching certain core elements with certain diversity, equity, and inclusion related needs. So this included both solo and collaborative with our cross-functional team heuristic evaluations to identify those themes and start to pressure test the different variables that we were coming up with and the different elements that we were developing. Then we moved into, almost in a parallel track, a series of structured interviews with different key stakeholders in the process, where we were starting to learn a little bit more about how each person was thinking about or identifying different DEI needs, concerns, things that they wanted to address, elements that they wanted to include in the game development process, especially so that we could capture what diversity, equity, and inclusion in game development meant across each of these different roles. Because since we are thinking about and examining our specific kind of relationship to game development in different ways, it was important to capture that wide breadth and that wide range of the relationship that people have to games, especially those involved in the development process. And then lastly, we also paired this with a pretty extensive landscape review. So really acknowledging, that we were only one game team here. There's a lot of really fantastic internal, external research and different case studies that we can examine and pull from across the industry. So making sure that we were also pulling together and grounding our work in what we were seeing outside of our particular space. This was really integral for defining the way that we might evaluate this in a standardized and processual way. So this did involve a multi-step and multi-method process. This is a quicker look, or a broader look rather, at how these different methods fit into a broader timeline. So we did this problem scoping first. This is where a lot of the interviews took place to better understand what these different themes were for relationship, not only to DEI, but also the issues that they were identifying for integrating this into game development. We did our landscape and literature review, kind of the part one, and how we were developing our different goals for this project. A lot of the resource structuring is where we started to really materialize these specific kind of core elements that we were seeing in games and how they aligned with specific core issues or needs in the DEI space through our heuristic evaluations and through the continuation of a landscape review. And then at this point, after the resource structuring, was where we had a full draft of the evaluation process, a full draft of the specific rubric as an outcome of all this research. And we moved into a feedback gathering stage where we took this to many different teams to start to pressure test the elements that we were thinking about. We continued to do continued heuristic evaluations as well to see how this would come to play and come to fruition for specific games that we were developing. And we also, of course, socialized and started to present this to get feedback more broadly. And the last thing I want to touch on in terms of method is a quick look at these resources that were part of our internal and external literature review and our landscape review. We did use a lot of existing Google resources on product inclusion and diversity research, as well as working with other teams that were centered on diversity, equity, inclusion across our particular team and sub-team and our org more broadly. We use a lot of academic literature just to give you a sense of kind of where we were pulling from and how we were situating our understanding of this work. We looked at things in socially inclusive design, user-centered game design, critical interface studies, so really understanding how this could be applied in kind of the physical space of gameplay development and in specific features and elements of UI, as well as reflective design, because a part of this is also active reflection on our part as folks who are involved directly in game development. And then we looked at nonprofit, public organization, and think tank resources as well. So resources from media representation and media literacy, again, situating this within a broader understanding of video games as a form of media, kind of susceptible to the same types of, especially inclusion and equity issues that we're seeing across the board. Okay, so now I'll move into some findings. I have to preface this by saying that this is not necessarily kind of the full breadth of findings. So some of the finer details, I am going to cover themes here, but some of the finer details I'm not quite able to share yet. I'm working on a paper to open source this more broadly and kind of share the exact language, for example, that we use in the rubric. But for now, I'm able to share some of these kind of higher level themes. But and I'm happy to go into as much detail as I can in question and answer after this as well. So one of the key findings here in an overarching way is that a key theme of what diversity, equity, inclusion looks like in games is ensuring that a player's identity is never a factor that limits their ability to play, and it's never a factor that serves as a particular barrier to play either. So this is something that surfaces often in kind of accessibility research as well, that continues to play a really big role when we're looking at inclusion in games. And so diving a little bit deeper into that, to evaluate the actual kind of way that that identity might serve as kind of an entry point to playing a game, we need to identify and resolve anything that we see as particularly exclusionary or potentially harmful and in elements that we see in a game. So as we break down things like the core loop of a game, as we break down the objective, the missions, the characters, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides, we look at each of those really carefully and have specific variables we're looking at that may tie into identity and interaction. But that's also not enough. So we need opportunities beyond that in the realm of proactive inclusion for players to customize their experience, because that's a big part of acknowledging our own limitations and our own kind of biases and assumptions as people involved in the game development process, where we're not able to anticipate every way that a player might want to approach and engage with the game. So anywhere that we can surface customization and ability to integrate preference wherever possible is an important kind of second half of this whole evaluation process. So here, this is all really surfacing a mixture of both reactive and proactive inclusion practices. So this really materializes in a couple of different categories that are embedded within the overall rubric and evaluation process itself. So we identified a couple key categories of DI assessment that each contain a few different variables that we look at in every single game that went through our process. The major categories here, based on these heuristic evaluations of games, the interviews that we ran as people talked through the different kind of components of games that come together to form a major game. And in our review, the key categories here that materialized were representation and interaction. So really looking at the way that players can actually see themselves represented in a game, all the different kind of possibilities that they have for moving through a game as a particular character or as a particular identity, and then all of the interactive elements that really are the kind of grounding and the foundational movement behind all of that representation. And then within representation and interaction are subcategories that really capture the even finer details of how a player actually engages and interacts with the different elements. And that includes characters, the narrative, the aesthetic, and the actual objectives. So the missions that they're being asked to complete, the tasks that they're being asked to do in a game. So as I mentioned before, you can think about this as a process that's continually nesting. So we have this top line goal of identity not being a particular barrier. What that means is evaluating the way that players are able to engage both in terms of representation and interaction. Within that, there's the character's narrative, objectives, and so on. And within each of those spaces, there are variables that we continue to assess and break down through different types of ongoing methods in our research. So these variables are the ability to play central characters, complete different objectives, and understand the story. So the way that this actually kind of physically materializes in the process is sets of questions that actually measure and assess this from the player perspective. The second major bucket here of variables is avoidance of specific stereotypes. A lot of this at an initial phase can actually just be done too internally. So as we're doing things like continued longer term heuristic evaluations on games at different points in development, often we can be the first kind of point of reference for identifying anything that could potentially serve as either an explicit stereotype or continuation or kind of an adaptation of one. This pairs really closely with accurate portrayal of specific communities and identities. So especially for games that are trying to do maybe boundary pushing things in terms of telling new stories, especially stories of folks who have been underrepresented or minoritized in player groups, really ensuring that that portrayal is done well. This involves very heavy leaning through things like surveys, through things like interviews and play test on self-reported kind of assessment too of the way that they see themselves presented in a game. And then the last major bucket of variables is around player empowerment. So are there places in the game where we can more proactively set out a set of features, maybe social features or communication features or other areas of customization that can further empower players to maybe continue to push past certain barriers that they may see to access to play, but also especially ideally if there aren't many barriers present, really continue to push to the next level of being able to see themselves represented and being able to interact in the most ideal ways. So as part of this work, as we were going on, so that was sort of the identification phase, really breaking down what are the core elements that we're trying to look at, how do they all fit together, what are the variables that we want to assess and measure and evaluate over time. And so to validate a lot of these themes and categories that we were seeing, we began to examine not just in our in-house games that we were developing, but also in games across the industry, continuing that landscape review and turning that into a more longer term project of evaluation and validation. We began to examine how that might be evaluated even in existing games that we saw today. So how does this apply? Is there consistency in the different variables and core elements that we're looking at, even in games that are already out and being used in the day-to-day? So as part of this, there's almost a parallel track and project. We were starting to collect different game examples, especially reviews of different games, to collectively and collaboratively pressure test and further validate these themes. So this turned into building out an almost repository of case studies and examples of success and non-success. A couple of examples for folks who know these games, we have Mass Effect here, Hades, Overwatch, a lot of games that are kind of pushing the boundaries in terms of character representation, customization of gameplay elements, especially. So getting into spaces around kind of like more intricate difficulty and challenges and levels, the way that you can move through a game and engage with it. So how was all of this used? We identified these categories. We started to pressure test and validate these themes in our games and in existing games. What did it look like to actually integrate this long-term into our game development process? So this whole rubric and these set of categories and variables I just reviewed became a core part of our user experience research, or UXR, game milestone evaluation process. So what this means, the most important piece to remember here, is that we were able to build this into the way that we fundamentally assessed and evaluated and thought about the quality of games. So inclusion was a core piece of how we are thinking about game quality. And this was applied through a lot of the same methods that we used to develop the rubric, because they are a lot of the traditional kind of games user research methods. We continue to embed this specific questions related to those components and those categories in our heuristic evaluations, in our play tests when we were observing people playing games and asking them how the game experience was. There were key questions related to that. And then in our internal cross-functional reviews, we also had an embedded piece centered around inclusion. And the key kind of aims for all of this, all of these methods I lay out here, were for flagging and resolving any DEI issues that we saw come up, and promoting proactive inclusion. So really identifying and pushing specific game teams that we were working with to think about how we could even go an extra mile or go a next step in terms of addressing the elements that we were assessing. Right, so I'll move into our last section here and then open things up for questions. So I'd like to take this back to where we started, essentially. I'll take us back briefly to the conversation at the start of this talk. A lot of the examples that you all shared really surfaced that games can have a pretty profound impact on our experiences, not only in the way that we maybe play games, but also how we think about games and observe them. And so as a form of media, we recognize that games do have a role to play in how we see ourselves in the world, how we connect to others and learn about ourselves, how we might even learn about different things through games or just be entertained. And identifying and understanding what's actually happening within those moments through the kind of key categories that we developed through this work, and how to actually establish a way to assess, evaluate, and measure them to enables us to capture the ability to recreate and support those moments in an applied way. And this is a really important part of a research contribution, especially to game development teams, but not only to game teams, also to any traditional, I would argue, digital media platform, really identifying kind of what the key components are that you're breaking down and looking at, what are the needs that you want to surface there, and what are the variables that you want to assess. Gaming continues really to grow in significance and use too. So though I do think that a lot of this could be translated and adapted to different forms of digital and traditional media, I think it's particularly important for games as it continues to grow in significance and use, because the responsibility that we all have, either as scholars in this place, in the space studying it, or industry practitioners in the space, really enable any player to play in a fun, safe, and welcoming way. I pulled this out from a paper from Isabella Granick in 2014, where her team talks about and lays out all of the different benefits of video games. It's a really fantastic paper if you haven't read it, because it gets me really excited and kind of pumped for the future of games. So much to learn and explore there. But here she's specifically talking about the role that it can play for younger viewers. If you've checked kind of the statistics on how many young people too, how many younger generations especially are playing games, it's really staggering, and it's going to continue to grow. So this means that also the diversity of the players that we're going to be engaging with continues to grow and continues to adapt. So this really is increasingly an important goal and space to work in. So through all of this work, we recognize that integrating inclusion in game development really centers on providing ways for any player to find content that they can connect with and engage with in positive ways. We learned through this project and through this research and development that it involves a pretty nuanced approach to DEI. So really first and foremost, defining what equity and inclusion and diversity means for our specific industry, but also for specific kind of game teams, recognizing and understanding where everyone's coming from and what their role is to play in upholding these specific principles and applying them. So it does involve defining what that means for your own area. And involved a lot of iteration on the approach with stakeholders. So thinking about how to actually kind of measure this in an ongoing way that made sense for and could include the input of multiple different people on the team. It very critically involved planning for specific process integration. So understanding where, once we had all these insights about kind of what the key categories are of equity and inclusion in games and how to measure it, especially once we had insights from actual players through heuristic evaluations and play tests on what they felt the kind of level of inclusion was in all of the games that we were developing, we had to have a place for integrating that and actually incorporating all of those insights. So planning for process integration, which was done through using this as a key kind of pillar of game quality, was an important part of really landing this entire project and ensuring that it was actually upholding the goals that we wanted it to uphold. And of course, really helping to kind of use this as a tool for further educating our team members too, so that it gained more adoption, so that the more teams were using it, more people are understanding it. It requires here a trust in developers to acknowledge and understand kind of what the core issues here are and what the role they have to play. And it also requires trust in our players to be able to share what their insights, kind of reflections and experiences are in the questions that we're asking, often questions that can be sensitive and maybe challenging and difficult, but important nonetheless. And all of this really fulfills a key role of us as game developers or people maybe even tangentially involved in this process to create content that speaks to many players in all the varied and diverse ways that we want it to. This is a quick snapshot of what this type of process integration looks like. There's a lot more kind of documentation that I could show around this that really helped get to this point. But one way to think about it in terms of thinking about inclusion in game development as a core piece of quality and as a core kind of pillar that we're assessing as we decide whether or not, you know, a game is kind of ready to move on to the next phase of development, for example, is having these key questions we're asking across the board that have specific insights from players attached to them that our game teams need to address and also resolve before moving forward. So in the very beginning, in the concept stage, we're asking what accessibility, diversity, and inclusion considerations are needed based on design goals. What this could look like is a quick kind of heuristic evaluation where we assess a game, look at a game, kind of identify what's mapping onto those specific categories and variables we developed. In the production phase, we're asking, is there an actual plan in place for the game to be accessible in all the different kind of ways we want it to be for core and new players? And then as we move into the live phase, as we get ready to actually launch a game, we are constantly assessing in these different game development pieces or game development stages rather, is the game actually accessible in the ways that we want it to? Is the plan actually taking place the way that we would like? And I'll end on the note that this was impactful both in and out of game. So on an individual game level, we're asking all these questions, getting all these insights and flagging and resolving specific issues that we're seeing to make these games more inclusive. But this was also really helpful in furthering team and company-wide educations, really educating on people on why this is important, getting them involved in that process. It was used, of course, as an active tool for evaluation across our game portfolio. One of the things that I'd like to kind of share out further is the actual kind of changes that we're able to make to characters, to objectives, to the way that our players were able to move through games. I'd love to use some of this as different case studies of this plan in action. We integrated this into our leadership review process, and we also use it as a catalyst for additional collaborations and partnerships. So I mentioned at the start of this that even though Stadia is no longer an active org, this continues to be work that I'm involved in different capacities with YouTube, and a lot of my colleagues at Stadia are kind of continuing a lot of this work in their own respective studios and companies. So I'll end with a summary, kind of recapture of why all of this is important. really integral for ensuring the physical, cognitive, and psychological accessibility of all of our games for our players, in service of enabling players to have these positive, meaningful, and hopefully transformative experiences. This is going to help us bring games to where they need to be to meet the needs of not only today's players, but also ideally tomorrow's players. And I'll end there. Thanks so much for your attention. I'd love to open it up for questions. Sorry, no, I just pulled it.
I was just curious if y'all categories for your DEI assessment, if you ran into any examples or issues where like there was a contradiction between like a major and subcategory. Like for example, in like Animal Crossing, there is like a wheelchair items you can like sit in, and it's like a chair, but it's not, so it's like an aesthetic, but it's not an interactable item like you can't use in the way.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. So the answer is yes. A lot of the ongoing validation work was around identifying and catching, what some of these conflicting kind of spaces could be. Another example actually was a lot of like satirical games or like kind of comedic elements of games. So one of the principles that we built into the overarching application of the rubric was that obviously, this is there are elements of it that are always going to be more subjective and that need often further conversation across the kind of collaborative team that's applying the rubric. So sometimes we would take cases like that, and rather than just having the researcher carry out the assessment and analysis of all of that, maybe out of a play test, we have a larger group discussion on how we would actually kind of put that or kind of categorize that in the rubric. So a little bit, sometimes that's a little bit more of like a art plus science type of application. It can be, there are definitely elements that can get fuzzy. So I think it's a really great call out. That was also a big part of the education piece, I think, for this was there is this tendency and kind of excitement to say, oh, we're going to have these like really clean categories. We're going to apply them. It's going to be so smooth and standardized over time. And it's just, it's going to work like a well-oiled machine. And so a lot of the expectation setting as part of that, especially as we were doing the validation phase, was around, okay, there are always going to be these fuzzy moments. There are always going to be points at which we might need to make like a specific call as a team too. So say that for this game and for this particular context, depending on kind of what the needs are there. So if it's, for example, like a negative thing that we're flagging that we need to make a call on, we might defer towards a more kind of like conservative categorization and recommendation around how we want to resolve it. Yeah, great call. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually to that point also, that was a really great talk. Thank you. That was so informative. Something that I was wondering is, so when you were researching with like stakeholders and developers, did you ever face any I guess pushback, right word, but some people say like, oh, it's too like, it's really hard to implement DEI because it's too general to say like you're gonna put us across all different games, or like making these adjustments according to DEI principles ruin the aesthetic of the game or something like that. Did you ever face pushback like that? And if you did, like how did you resolve that?
Yeah, that's also a really great question. So thankfully, I maybe it was because of the work of like the team, to even folks that were on the team before me who had started this conversation a little bit earlier. I can't say that I faced like explicit, pushback where someone said, almost verbatim, like this isn't important or that we don't need to do it. I think there was at least enough understanding that there was like a starting point for moving forward. But it was difficult, I would say, to your point, to gain an understanding and kind of like a shared context around how this might work in a more standardized way across our portfolio. So I think you're exactly right that there can be skepticism around, oh, there's so many different types of games. It's such a subjective and creative process. How can we possibly do this in a more kind of across the board way? So I did have to do a lot of work to, I think a big part of where the this is a big part of where the interviews came into play too, is better understanding, okay, where might some of these questions or the skepticism come from, and how can we actually address that in the design of the evaluation process? How do we help kind of allay these types of concerns? And so there, actually, the bringing in the acknowledgement, especially in kind of the background and setup to our process as we were kind of socializing this, as we were working on it together, bringing in the fact that there will be some subjective parts of it, and that we're upfront acknowledging, it is a really kind of complex and difficult task to do this across multiple different game genres, was an important piece, and I think helped allay some of those concerns. Another part, though, was actually recognizing that we're doing to the best of our ability. The aim is to really distill down to these core components we're seeing across different games, even if they are materializing in different ways. So, with like outside of the, specific lens of DEI, there is in, most games, I won't say all games, but in most, there's still a core loop. There's still, like character creation. There's still a narrative, there's still these kind of distilled components that we can come back to and anchor around. And then maybe the interpretation of it could look a little bit different. Yeah, so great question though. Yeah.
So what the games what Stardew Valley and I've been before. I know that like there's a lot of mods like happening in Stardew Valley where people add like features that aren't in the actual game. When you were evaluating games, did you include like mods that made the game more accessible that weren't made by the actual developer in your evaluation, or were you just looking at the base game?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think this was one of the areas where it was sad our time together as like kind of the core team working on this project was cut a bit short, because that's where we're kind of moving into next. We were starting with, just for ease of kind of, just for simplicity's sake and ease of kind of getting a core kind of foundational process out. We started with only kind of the original intended elements of a game. So what the original developers put in. But I think you're completely right that a sort of next phase of this work could be looking at the layered elements that are added on top through all these different modifications. I will say, like, some of that came up too in some of our play tests. We would have players that brought up, oh, usually I use this type of communication feature, or I play the level in this way because I use this particular mod. So we captured some of those insights, but I think didn't get kind of as robustly fold that in as far as how it might even change, some of the elements that we might be looking at. So yeah, great. I think next step for the project. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so one of the things we talked about was sometimes, for example, like female players may feel not very included in the society or like the community of game. So I'm wondering if any of the rubrics includes how the game manages like the community or something, or is like how the game try to censor or try to moderate like players' communications. Is that like some part included? If there is, can you share with us like some type of rubric related to that?
Yes. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're talking about the features in the game that might control the way players communicate with each other. Is that right? Yes. So definitely that was included in the interaction section of the rubric. So this was really dealing with all of the different features that either were in service. So a lot of this kind of fell into the bucket of things in service of completing the objectives, because arguably communication elements are still part of that. So you're interacting maybe with other players to achieve a specific, to complete a mission, to achieve a certain set of objectives. So we did have specific variables we were looking at there. Some of the examples of sort of like the proactive inclusion piece were things like, potentially thinking about opportunities for different ways that we might like match certain players. So to some of the points that we were bringing up earlier, what does it look like to actually to remove certain kind of barriers of fear or sort of challenges around like who you might be matched with in a particular communication setting, or how you might access different players. Are there ways that you can kind of access a smaller network of people that you might want to communicate with to complete an objective? That's kind of one quick example. But a lot of that actually, especially the communication kind of social features element, we found opened up, a completely other realm. There's so much to unpack there. And that was something I was really excited about because, as I mentioned before, my background's in social media studies and kind of using different forms of media to connect and communicate with one another. So a sort of additional project was actually developing out an even more detailed kind of process for just our social features. So yeah, it's a great point and something that's kind of ongoing.
Yeah, it's very short. I just.
Oh, I think they had a question. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that since you already got to ask one, but I'm happy to stay after. Of course, yeah.
As a graduate student in the professional program, you're exposed to lots of different practical methods, but the thing I hadn't heard before that I really liked is pressure testing. So I was curious to know more about that and how I could learn.
Oh, yes, definitely. So there I was mostly just, I was referring to, I think this is probably me just using like a cheeky industry term, but anyway, essentially it's like the validation process, like part of the validation process for ensuring that these things that we're developing internally are actually applicable at scale, like in a larger sense. And I think that there I'm referring to it as pressure testing, especially because this involved sort of, at least like from my personal experience compared to the way that I would develop methods like in an academic setting versus industry, the pressure testing was like much more kind of like rapid iteration style. So looking at, maybe like in one setting across our team, we'd spend like 3 hours, playing sections of all these different games, like really quickly kind of like assembling, this large spreadsheet that we were analyzing together and really talking about in real time, kind of what are the, per our conversation earlier, actually, what are the things that we're seeing that are coming into conflict with one another? Where are kind of the contentions? What are things that we might want to change kind of right away versus longer term? And I think it's something I find it really valuable because even in kind of the first pressure testing session, you can get so much out of it that then folds into a lot of the kind of longer term validation we might do. Yeah. Happy to talk about it more though. Thank you so much for all of your questions. It was really great.
I wanted to know.